Can we just open the session in a word of prayer? Gracious God, our Father, we are thankful that we can come to Thee. We come to Thee in the precious name of the Lord Jesus. We bless Thee that it is through Him we have all the blessings that are available to us. They are in Christ Jesus. We're thankful for an occasion like this when we can be together to speak of matters relating to the marriage, a wonderful institution of Thine, our God, that has been under attack. And we would desire to be fortified and fitted as those who are prepared to maintain the standards, the divine standards in our own relationships with our spouses. We ask for wisdom for the day, direction and help, the energy of the Spirit, and most of all for result, for Thy glory and honor, and for our blessing. We ask it in the name of the Lord Jesus. Amen. Amen. I am indeed happy to be here with you. It's been a while that I became acquainted with your church activities here, starting with Brother Frank and Brother John Quince, whom I met over 8 years ago. And then I had a revisit with Brother Frank and Brother John recently when I was invited to come and speak today. It's a joy to be able to take up matters like these as it relates to families, relationships, couples. In a day like this when everything is falling apart and there is a surrendering of the standards, we were just commenting downstairs as to the importance of maintaining God's holy standard. That the world has its own standard, but God has His standard. And our responsibility is to stand firm and stand fast in regard to the things that God has left on record for us. I'm going to, in the presentation, do at least 35 to 40 minutes of lecturing, and then I'm going to open up for Q&A. I think that's important because it helps me to get a sense as to whether or not you are getting the basic elements and the tenets of what has been said. And then also it can open up the door for further enlightenment on anything that I might have missed. So with your pen and paper, take notes so that you can ask questions, because questions are very helpful in terms of giving greater clarity. So I want you to be prepared with your questions. I don't promise you that I'll have answers, but we'll try. I want to begin by reading, first of all, just a couple verses from the book of Genesis, if you have your Bible with you. The book of Genesis, chapter 2, the book of beginnings. And it's wonderful that God has given us the beginnings concerning the marriage relationship at the very get-go, the very early stages of Genesis sets before us in chapter 2, verses 18 to 25. Jehovah Elohim said, "It is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helpmate, his like." And out of the ground Jehovah Elohim had formed every animal of the field and all fowl of the heavens, and brought them to man, to see what he would call them. And whatever man called each living soul, that was its name. And man gave names to all cattle, and to the fowl of the heavens, and to every beast of the field. But as for Adam, he found no helpmate his like. And Jehovah Elohim caused a deep sleep to fall upon man, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs, and closed up flesh in its stead. And Jehovah Elohim built the rib that he had taken from man into a woman and brought her to man. And man said, "This time it is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This shall be called woman, because this was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And they were both naked, man and his wife, and were not ashamed." I use that as the springboard, and more than likely we will have additional scriptures referred to or even read. But I'd like us to use that today as the jumping off level from which we address this most important matter of marriage, God's great institution. Before we begin, I would like you to, in your own minds, bear in mind not to look at your marriage as it is. Do not look at your marriage as it is, but look at your marriage as to its potential. Look at your marriage as to its potential. Because if we look at our marriages as they are at the moment, most of us would probably be heading for the divorce court. But thank God we are encouraged to look at marriage from its potentiality, from what is available in it, so that ultimately we can live up to that potentiality. We can reach up to it and measure up to it, and as a result experience the maximum out of our marriages. In the book of Genesis, as we just read, we saw that the marriage is what has been divinely ordered. It's ordered of God, instituted by Him. He had brought man into being through creation. He brought Adam out of the dust, formed him out of the dust, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and then he gave Adam a complement. He subsequently put Adam to sleep, and from his rib, it says, he built a woman. Unusual expression, built. He made man, Adam, but he built the woman. And I emphasize that because building has a uniqueness to it. When you build, if any of you are architects or builders, when you build, there's a meticulous activity that takes place in building. You get a blueprint. With the blueprint, you follow it and structure or construct the building with all of the requirements associated with it. This is what God did. He took the rib, and he meticulously formed and framed her, putting her into a position that makes her different from Adam himself, so that she is a structure in herself that can contain things. She has a womb. Just so happens we men don't have one. Preparing her in a very special way to express what he wants as a complement to the man. So that you remember that Adam had looked around for someone his like in the animal kingdom, because that's all he had. And in looking around, he concludes that there was not one animal that was complementary to himself. God says, I've got it. I've got it. And that's when God put together and structured the woman and brought her to Adam. Why, God said? Because it wasn't good for man to be alone. When we're alone, we're in bad company. So God says, I'm going to give you a complementarity. Then the challenge was that she is to leave, or rather he is to leave his mother and father and cleave to his wife. Well, you never get instruction to the wife to leave, you know, although she does leave. But it's us men who very often need that instruction, because we have a tendency to hang on to mama's coattails. So he says, you are to leave and cleave. So if you leave, it's an attachment that has to occur. You are to cleave, and then it says they both became one flesh. And this, we would see, has a lot to do with the sexual intimacy. Not just one flesh, only in terms of the fact that they're two turned into one, but there is a merging, physical merging that occurs, hence one flesh. 1 + 1 in the mathematical realm of life is equal to 2. But in God's mathematical realm, 1 + 1 is equal to 1. And God wants that kind of oneness to be maintained in its pristine condition. That there is to be that oneness. And if we appreciate that that's what we are, then there is no opportunity for the merging in of anything else that can impede that oneness. That oneness then involves commitment and investment. You hear very often that marriage is 50-50. I say to you, marriage is not 50-50. Marriage is 100-100. Because the tendency of thinking is 50% of investment on my part and 50% on her part will equal to the 100. No. The problem is not the 50% that you give or the 50% she gives. It's the 50% you keep back. That creates the problem. Hence, there must be a total commitment and investment. I tell the story all the time of the pig and the chicken who had a big conversation in the United Nations in their council concerning which one brings the most to breakfast. And so there was a real debate between the two. And you know what the chicken brings and you know what the pig brings. And eventually, while the debate went on, the pig halted the discussion and said, listen, Miss Chicken, you bring your eggs, you come and sit on your nest every morning, drop your eggs, someone comes out, picks them up, does what has to be done with them, and you come back tomorrow morning to do the same. He says, when I give, I have to die. In order for you to have bacon, I have to die. So who gives the most? He says to the chicken, you contribute, but I make a commitment. Commitment then involves sacrifice. The pig would sacrifice himself. Commitment involves that in regard to our marriages. Marriages, and I trust that as we speak today, we are speaking as those who understand God's particular order. Because if you're looking for a secular presentation today, you're going to have to go to someplace else. You probably have to go to the center up the road. But no, if you're here today on the line of the presentation, it's going to come from God's standard. because it's the only standard that supports, sustains, and maintains the marriage in its true character. And I say very often, that if you are going to have a manual as a standard for your marriage relationship, that manual has to come from the very one himself who has formed, who has created this marital relationship. That's his precious word. He stands by what he does, and he does what he means in regard to what he institutes. Hence, in the marriage relationship, there is a responsibility for there to be prayer as the central theme, and the reading of God's word as the central theme for sustaining your marriage. Apart from that, you're going to wing it. And winging it means that you're going to find grave difficulties. Hence, you husbands have the responsibility, and we'll come to that, to provide leadership. And it's not a despotic type of leadership. No, it's not. It's not an autocratic type of leadership either. It's leadership that has with it the idea of giving support, giving guidance, giving directions. So the challenge to us as husbands is in Ephesians 5. Husbands, love your own wives as Christ loved the church. Ephesians 5:25. And then he says, you are to love her as your own body. As your own body. How much care do we as men invest in our bodies? Lots of care. We shower them, we clean them up, then we put on some smell-em-good'ems, and we give an aura that is very attractive. That's what we do. The Spirit of God in Ephesians says, then you are to do that with your wife. She is your body, therefore you are to nurture, nourish, support, and sustain her. Nourishing takes time. It's an investment. And so the Spirit of God in Paul to the Ephesians points out the importance of that nourishing and cherishing and caring. Then the wife's responsibility is to submit to her own husband. Now the expression, that little word own, pops up both for the husband as well as for the wife. Your own. That is, you do not have any authority over another person's husband or over another person's wife. It is your own. That's where the focus is to be. The problem for us very often is when we lose that focus and we start looking around us. The danger exists as a result, and that's where infidelity and things of that sort can find an opening in our marital relationships. Then there's an expression about fearing, F-E-A-R-I-N-G. Fearing her husband. And the analogy comes from Sarah in the Old Testament, who reverenced Abraham, her husband, and called him Lord. Now, I'm not telling you husbands to go around expecting that your wives are going to call you Lord, or for that matter, you wives to feel that, what is this? You're putting an obligation upon us to call our husbands Lord. No, that's not what we're implying. We're just simply saying that Sarah had the spirit of she captured the spirit of what God had in mind in terms of reverence and respect. Because one of the things that we'll discover that a husband looks for in his wife is this matter of respect. And what the wife looks for is to be cherished, cared for, and nourished. So there is an equal sense of responsibility that's put upon all of us. So Sarah calls him Lord in the regard of respect for him and giving him deference in her own mind. Expectations in marriage. Here are some expectations. Marriage will meet the needs of us in these different ways. It will meet the need for affection and sexual intimacy. And that certainly is one of the ultimate things in the marriage relationship, and we'll come back to that. It provides conversation. It would meet the need for conversing. Man was alone. He had no contact with the animal kingdom save but to care for them. And then God came in, as we said, and provided. So there was the atmosphere now with Adam and Eve for verbal interchange and exchange, conversation. So it provides that. Then it provides companionship, the support, the feelings of comfortability that come from having one who is akin with you. That's companionship, not being alone. It provides family, because ultimately out of the intimacy will come, we trust, offspring, which will then develop the family. Then it will also provide financial security. As we work, unfortunately today, we're living in a society where both members of the household have to work in order to sustain things. But nevertheless, it was the responsibility that was put upon Adam that by the sweat of his brow, he was to eat bread and to provide for his family. And so it provides for financial security, provides for that within the household that meets the entire need of the household. Reasonable expectations. God desires that these expectations that we have should be met. And he has provided amply for them to be met in the marital circle. Very often there is a feeling that in marriage, what will happen is it will change us. So I go into marriage with the idea that I'm going to change my wife, or I'm going to change my husband. I'm going to make him or her just what I think it should be, he or she should be. Well, let's be careful, because very often the issue is not changing her or changing him. The issue is really changing me. And if we're not prepared, even as we sit here today, and as I began with the thought of looking at the potentiality of your marriage rather than the actuality of your marriage, if we're going to look at the potentiality, this will enable us to realize that if we're going about this matter of trying to change our partner, then maybe we need to stop and revisit that and realize that it's a matter of changing me, changing oneself. Very often we do this because we have some predetermined idea as to what the other person should be. We have this kind of structure that we want to fit our partner into. And as a result, that leads to some serious trouble, because then you're going to have tremendous resistance. So let's stop plotting the course to try to achieve our objective. But you say to me, but he's that bad, or she's that terrible, and there needs to be a change. And I think I need to be helpful in this. Well, let God make the change. Let's let him make the change. Because what would happen is, each time we attempt to change the partner, we're going to come up with a disillusioned feeling. Because we're not making success. We're not making inroads. We're not achieving. But then it also, if I'm going to change my partner, it's going to put a lot of pressure on my partner. Unnecessarily so. Which will lead ultimately to possibly some withdrawing, some pulling away, some resistance because I'm not responsive to the pressure that you're putting upon me. Marriage can be very free. Marriage can be a sphere of liberty. Marriage can give us everything that we need and everything we want. But it depends on how we're going to let that course run. If I'm going to be the one to put pressure, then it will blow itself up. What we need is a different attitude. So let's set some ideals then and boundaries for each other. Let's set some boundaries. Boundaries are good, I have a friend who's with the Lord now. When he first came to my house, he lived in Canada, Beamsville. At that time, we had not yet put a fence up for our property. And he would say to me all the time, Dave, fences make good neighbors. Fences make good neighbors. In the marriage, boundaries are fences. They make good marriages. They enable you to not only establish lines of demarcation, but they enable you to remain within the context, within the confines of those boundaries. And if we remain within those boundaries, guess what? Good neighbors? We're safe. We're safe. If I stay within my property, my next door neighbor has no right to say anything to me about where I am. Because I'm in my property. But if there are not proper boundaries, the tendency is that I might wander onto his, and then he has a right to say something. So let's have healthy marital boundaries. They offer us a great deal of latitude and freedom when we have healthy boundaries. We can go in and out. We can go and come. And we can expect few demands, no questions asked. Marriage will enable us to serve one another's needs. So are we at a disposed position to allow ourselves to be serviceable to one another? This is where we begin to experience growth and development. As needs are met, there is encouragement, there is building, there is excitement, because everything is working according to the divine standard. Spending time and caring and pleasing each other is the responsibility that the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 7, thereabout in verse 28 to 35, sets upon us. That in the bounds of marriage, in 1 Corinthians 7, needs are met. We serve one another. And we serve one another as under the Lord, the Lordship of Christ. And as a result, then there is going to be result and benefit from coming under divine lordship and order. Marriage will change us ultimately for the better once there is the spirit of working cohesively together in the relationship. It will expose our hearts. It will issue some demands upon us, which we are prepared to answer to, because all the spiritual requisite that is there, we will respond as those who want to please God and come under God's order. It will cause us to put each other's interests first. We will not be selfish. You remember 1 Corinthians 13? At your leisure, you can look at that. It never tells us what love is, you know, in a sense. It has a tendency of telling us what love does not do. It's not hurtful. It does not think of its own. So the character of that wonderfully sets before us God's divine order of what love is all about. It will not cause us to focus on the faults of the partner. Very easy for us to do that, isn't it? We have the habit of finding the fault so that we can pinpoint what's going wrong. But at the same token, they tell me all the time that when you point the index finger, 4 fingers come back at you. The 3 that are curved, and then the thumb pointing this way. So who becomes the guilty individual? The one who is doing the pointing. So finding fault very often hurts the character and the flow of the relationship, because it puts the other person on the defensive. And when we are on the defensive, and there is also the offensive approach, what do we have? We have a battle. We have a battle. We have the very makings, the groundwork for contention. Marriage will place us in the realm of love. It will give us a sense of the spirit of love. If you think of the Song of Songs in chapter 4, she says, "Let my beloved come into his garden and eat of his fruits." Song of Songs is a very tender book. It's the relationship ultimately of Christ and his church, but it is also the relationship of a husband and a wife. The wife is inviting her husband into her garden. And I'm expecting that that garden is full of fruits, and it's full of vegetation of one sort or another, and it must be appealing. So she invites him. And then in chapter 5, verse 1, he says, "I am come into my garden." He responds. So if there is a call, there will also always be a response. And that is what love will create. Marriage and love will create the spirit of mutuality. Marriage is a picture of Christ and his church. Ephesians 5, we go back to the concepts there. The Apostle Paul, in writing, after he sets out the responsibility of the husband and the wife, and given instructions as to how those responsibilities are to be carried out, he comes back at the end and he says, if you think I was just talking about a husband and wife alone, Let me tell you who I was talking about. I was talking about Christ and the church. If we know somewhat of that, Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. That is, the love of Christ has with it an element of what is sacrificial. He gave himself. And so the apostle is saying, just as Christ has done that, just as the church now is subject to Christ, so should the wives be subject to their husbands. And as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it, so also is the husband to do for his wife. Now, I'm going to develop for us some matters in relation to communication in marriage. And after this, then we will stop and take questions from you, and hopefully some answers. Communication in marriage is a very vital commodity. It's the essence on which any marriage, the premise on which any marriage exists. If there is dysfunctionality in marriage, it's often because of communication. Communication is essential because we need that even in life in general. We need it in order to get through at the supermarket. You have to ask questions about what products you're looking for. You have to ask about the cost. So communication is as essential to life as I usually give the example, a knife to the kitchen. There'll be no functionality in the kitchen effectively if there is not a good, nice, sharp knife in the kitchen. And even when you sit at the dining table and you begin to eat, you need the knife to cut up pieces of your food. See how essential it is? Well, that's what communication is like. It's your lifeline. It's your master key to opening up tremendous doors that might be locked at the moment in your relationship, which shuts off certain rooms in your house or in your heart. You need that master key of communication to open those doors up so that you can access those rooms. And God wants us to do that. So how are we going to do that? The question is, what kind of communicator are you? John Powell, in his book, Why Am I Afraid to Tell You Who I Am?, talks about 5 levels of communication. He starts with level 5 and he works up to level 1. And he sees level 5 as just basic day-to-day expressions, like, how's the dog? Who's taking it out today? It's an element of safe communication, safe conversation, because there is no depth associated with it. No personal sharing involved. It's just sort of cliche type conversation. Then level 4 rises a little bit to reporting the facts. We're a little bit more concrete, a little bit more substantive. We might talk about the gossips of the day, the latest piece of news that we just got about what Susie is doing down the block. But it has no commitment attached to it. It's just ideas, facts. Very often, it's like maybe the 6 o'clock news, where the anchorman sits at the desk. He receives all of the feed from all who have been out in the field. He receives the feed and he just regurgitates it. and we can be sometimes regurgitators in our communication. Then level 3 brings us to something a little bit more concrete, ideas and judgments. We're now kind of forming opinions and thought process about certain things. And it might involve a little bit of riskiness, so we need to take some caution. Then level 2, we begin to talk about feelings and emotions. When we start raising issues in our relationships about feelings and emotions, we're now beginning to touch sensitive spots. You know, we can sometimes hide behind the veneer of everything is okay, or everything is feeling okay. But if we are to start talking about the real issues that impact us, that touch deeply the core, then we start finding ourselves recoiling a bit. Well, Mr. Powell would like us to become a little bit closer to feelings, to begin sharing at this level and to express just what's going on with us. That's level 2. Then we come to level 1. And what do we get at level 1? Complete and absolute honesty. Complete and absolute honesty. Personal communication. The ability now to enter into where one is. What we are feeling. What is causing any difficulties whatsoever at all, we're able to talk about them. Now, it's a risky matter, you know, because once you begin to get a little deep, what begins to happen is vulnerability opens up. We're vulnerable at that point, which means that I might feel somewhat on the attack. How do you deal with that? It's risky. But honesty is the substantive part of being able to address things that are emotionally loaded and can become emotionally explosive. Now we have an opportunity to do that. So of these 5 levels, one might ask the question, where do you think you are in your communication? That's rhetorical. But it's for you to contemplate. Is it that we should be at level 5 sometimes, and then at level 4, and then at level 3, and then 2, and then 1, and then revert back? I think what Mr. Powell really wants, and I feel convicted about it myself, is that he wants us to be at level 1, where there is absolute honesty and frankness and liberty to be able to express the depth of emotions that are there. Because if we're not expressive of those emotions, then we will not get clarity about how to function. So we need to get to level 1 as quickly as possible. Now, our communication often takes on 3 different ways in which I might call techniques that are very often used. There might be linear communication, a communication that is sort of reflective on a one-sided, one-shot line very often. Or there may be circular type communication, which is a little bit more reflective of a mature response. It has the partner as the object, as opposed to in the linear, just one person. Here it is the partner as the object. Or we may have content-oriented communication. That is the substance. what kind of substance does my communication emit? If we don't have substance, then we will not arrive at any kind of result, because the conversations don't have any value, any weight to them. So what we want is to have conversations that deal specifically with issues, with specific issues that might be sensitive. You know, we shy away at times from speaking about certain issues with partners because we are fearful about the response. And why is that so? It's because we have not developed confidence in one another. That's an element, I think, that needs to be very often addressed. Why should I fear to communicate with my spouse? Or why should my spouse fear to communicate with me? Should never be. There should be the liberty, even though there will be the difference. Because there will be differences. We can't shy away from that. That's normal. But there should be the ability to put on the table the issues and then to negotiate ourselves a way through the same. Then there is processed communication. More often, partners who have a little bit more maturity in their relationship seem to engage in this processed communication. That is, you have the ability to sit face to face and to flesh out the things that differ, and to flesh them out in such a way that it makes your communication very positive, as opposed to being afraid to open the door because you never know what rat's going to come out. So let's create then a context for this effective communication. How to do that? Well, first of all, to communicate, we've got to talk to each other. Simple process. If we don't talk, we're not going to achieve any kind of success. So let's develop this habit of wanting to talk. I generally suggest to patients, and those of you who know my pattern, generally suggest to patients taking 30 minutes a week to sit together and to talk together about the issues that impact you. It's not to be a time for contention. It's just simply to be a time for developing a healthy approach to communicating. So if we have not been effectively communicating over the span of time, then what we are doing is creating a premise on which you can begin to interact with one another. And so it's like going back to kindergarten in our marriages. Let's go back to talking. Talk to each other. But while we talk to each other, then, we don't talk over each other. Because that's a habit. Because my point is as important as her point, and his point is as important, her point is as important as your point. So we need to be heard above. So what's the struggle that we enter when we do that? So I set out my point, and she sets out her point above, and then I raise the bar by coming back a little louder, and we keep escalating. Healthy communication? Absolutely not. So let's not talk over, let's not even talk through. Meaning, while he or she is speaking, the other is at the same time setting his point out or her point out. So we need to come back to level ground here. We need to be at a point where We have a sense of mutual respect. That is, you can speak, set your points out, allow me to, and vice versa. And that's a healthy way of structuring how to effectively communicate. Proximity and contact is very important. When we talk, let's not run from room to room. You know how that conversation goes, right? Start speaking, and he disappears, she disappears. And so we follow. And we keep following, and we keep escalating the tension. We're not de-escalating, and those are two words I like using all the time. De-escalate and diffuse. We're not doing that. What we're doing is escalating. And that's not a point of healthy contact with each other. Communicating is a process. It's a process. Take time to invest in that process. Make a commitment to talk regularly. In our applying these techniques, one of the things that can happen is that we need, in conversing with one another, to be able to use what we call I statements. I statements. That's I, not E-Y-E, but I, the letter. I statements. Why? Because we have the habit of always pointing to you. You did, you didn't, you saw, and so on and so forth. An I statement will help us appreciate or help the partner to appreciate how we're feeling. When you say so and so, I feel like so and so. So what you're doing is you're setting up not a bone of contention, but rather you're setting up a premise on which to have a healthy exchange. Because now your feelings are coming into the picture, and as a result, you are able to have your partner join with you in those feelings. I am feeling so and so when you do or say so and so, as opposed to being on the attack. And you know how we like that. That's our modus operandi, very often to be on the attack. Learn to listen. That's a big problem. There are about 12 blocks to listening, which I refer to when we do communication and communication skills in session. 12 blocks to listening. One of those blocks very often is mind reading. You know how we're good at that? We're very excellent at that. I can tell her what she's thinking. She can tell me what I'm thinking, as though we are God. We need to understand that we do not have the capacity. We are not given the ability to know what someone else is thinking. Hence, that's why we don't judge motives. Because I don't know what your motive is. I may be able to judge your action. I saw you attempting to break into the car outside, and so I can call you a thief. But other than that, I could not assess any particular motive of yours because I don't have that ability. Validating, besides listening, which is the thing we do not do very well, because I'm ready to say what I have to say, and you're ready to say what you have to say. Listening is a commodity that we lack very much in life in general, and then in our relationships. So let's learn to listen, which means that I'm going to have to stop. I'm going to have to hear you. And you're going to have to stop and you'll have to hear me. As opposed to me rattling on and you doing the same. Hence we have confusion. Validating is another aspect in relation to these techniques. Validating, understanding and seeking to understand where the other person is coming from. So if I said to you that I am feeling hurt because of what you said, then don't say back to me, I don't see why you're hurt. I don't see the reason for your hurt. You should not be hurt. Well, that's telling me that my feelings are not valid. If I am hurting, it's because I'm hurting and know that I'm hurting. So what we need to do for ourselves in our relationships is to compliment through validation. Validate that, yes, you are talking about a certain feeling, a certain disposition that you're having because of. Then we can come along and say, I hear you. I never intended for you to feel that way, but I hear you. My intent was XYZ. And that validation gives kind of a healthy sense of realization to the partner that you are with it, that you're understanding and are in agreement. Edit our conversation. Edit our conversation. What does that mean? If you are going to say something, before you click on the send button, reread it and ask yourself the question, if I was on the receiving end, would I like to receive this message? If I am on the receiving end of this message, would I want it? That to me is how to edit your conversation, because it will help you and me to realize that the content of our messages may not have the most appeal to it that it should have. Hence, we can change up the message. We can rewrite it, and then we can send it. I mentioned about obstacles to communication being the listening, being mind reading. Let me just go down a few quickly, and then I'm going to close. Mind reading, we said, is I know what you're thinking. Personalization is another way of another obstacle in communication. Personalization. What is that? Attacking the person instead of the problem. Attacking the person instead of the problem. So you know what? We've left the problem off. It was raised. Now we've gone away from the problem and we start to point the finger at you. So what am I doing? Is I'm destroying the person. We're no longer addressing the problem, we're addressing persons. So let's get back to addressing the problem and removing the personalization. Let's get back to avoid displacing our focus, because our focus should be on resolution of whatever the problem is and not on attacking the person. Distracting is another one of those obstacles. We leave the problem also, but what we do is we bring in another problem. Or for that matter, if I am saying you did, I'm going to come back and you're going to come back and say to me, but you remember last week what you did? So now we're not focusing on the issue at hand. We have now gone back to 2 years, to 3 years, when you did similar things, as opposed to addressing the issue at hand. And that is distracting. Let's stay within the present and focus on the issue at hand. Polarization. You always, you never, you are forever. You know the generalization of things that we do? And this time, you ask the question, well, when was it that I did that? And one, very often, there's no remembrance of me ever having done something. And two, if I did, it was 20, 30 years ago. So how does it become you always? How does it become a polarized matter and a generalized matter? So we want to be careful about those judgmental responses that we give that impact the health of communicating one with the other. So we might have to do this. Change our vocabulary. Change our vocabulary. Again, that connects with sending out the message, right? So if you go to the message again and you discover that the expressions that you've used are inappropriate and they signal a hostile type of approach as opposed to an ameliorating way, then we need to change the vocab and change the content of the message. Last but not least, 5 love languages. And you've heard of Gary Chapman and the book 5 Love Languages. And just to touch briefly, and then we will have some questions. First one is words of affirmation. We need, in words of affirmation, to have an element of care and concern. Because what do words of affirmation do? They are like stroking in the business. We stroke one another because we need it, not because I have my hand up over here and I'm asking you to give me something, but rather there are words of encouragement that a child needs, an adult needs. This matter of reinforcement. A child needs to have reinforcement that enables him or her to keep behaviors that are positive rolling. So likewise as adults, we need that measure of stroking that helps us to be motivated in our relationship with one another. So you get words that are encouraging words. Rather than, again, you never do or you're always doing, there are the words of encouragement that enables us to feel that there is a sense of appreciation that is occurring. And with appreciation, there is motivation even to do better. So there are words of encouragement, words of kindness, and he says there are humble words as well. Words that express in a certain way that we are not attempting to be haughty in our spirits, but rather we are very sedate and subtle in the sense of humble in terms of how we express things to one another. Then he says quality time is another important commodity. That is time that is well focused. Focusing attention on one another. Spending time conversing with one another and having healthy activities. That's quality time. We need that as couples. We need to take time out from time to time from our children, if it's at all possible. Grandma and grandpa can handle them. and we can get away and spend time together. Then there's the matter of receiving gifts. Well, you may say, well, I'm not a gift receiver, or I'm not a gift giver. But yeah, well, let's learn to give and receive gifts. Because what does that do? It helps to give one a sense of the feeling of appreciation. A gift is always good. We only think of it at Christmas or at birthdays. But look, it's something that can be done from time to time. And it does not have to have a marked occasion attached to it necessarily, but it can be, the one single rose or the dozen roses or whatever suits our partner. Gift giving receiving gifts is very, very important. It reminds one of love, and it's an investment. It's an investment in the marriage. Then there are acts of service. So the wife might say, well, I'm always serving, but I'm never getting any compensation for my service. So I feel somewhat like a doormat. Well, I trust that that's not the case. That in the acts of service, there is service that's done with a willing heart, a sense of determination because of the object that is receiving the act of service. The object is the object of love. Then, finally, physical touch. And very often we just think of this as intimacy, sexual intimacy, but it can go besides that. The physical touch, the holding of the hands, the rubbing of the shoulders, things that reassure that there is that which flows from one to the other. Now, my question to you is, do you think that Gary Chapman is just simply looking to see which one of these, rather, is your love language? I couldn't tell you what is in his mind, but I'm going to branch out a little by saying this. I don't know that there should be the idea that you have one or two of these love languages, and that is what marks you. I get the feeling that there should be a mutual experiencing of all of these aspects of these languages, that we should all be filled with every one of them in one form or another, some more expressive than the other, some more abundant than the other, but I believe that we should all express these languages in one form or another at one time or another, rather than just simply saying, well, mine is physical touch, and I'm finished. Rather, there should be the words of affirmation, the quality time, receiving of gifts, acts of service, and physical touch. With that, let's take some questions from you, and then we'll pick up on the next subject. I've covered two subjects. If you didn't realize that, I've covered marriage and I've covered communication, and we will come back and then pick up conflict and conflict resolution. So questions, please. Go ahead, Sue.
Just trying to make sense of everything, but I'll go at the beginning. When you're talking about the lead and the cleave, basically there's a push and pull. Basically you have to pull in order to realize the connection. So they're merged, but then you're putting boundaries on the merged entity. So there is a push and pull in the relationship, a dynamic that basically, also has to do with the fact that if you work on yourself and you're basically elevating yourself, you kind of have to help the other person that you're merged with elevate himself as well. And the question that I have is, because there is this push and pull dynamic in marriage, if the other party fails to actually raise to the occasion, for lack of better words, how do you solve that?
Certainly, it's a difficult thing when the other partner is non-responsive, as you would like him or her to be. So it's a lot of tenderness that's going to have to go in with this push and pull. Lingering as much as is within you to work with your partner, to encourage him or encourage her to take up the responsibility that is associated with the commitment that you made. Part of doing that would probably be, or most likely be, getting into therapy. Because if after a while you have lingered long with that partner and there seems to be a resistance, not willing to rise to the occasion, then you're going to have to seek the third party help to see how we can bring that into play. Then you may say, well, suppose my partner doesn't want to go into therapy. Certainly we can't force him or her, but we can encourage. But it is a lot of work that has to be done to linger with that kind of negligent response and apathetic behavior in the relationship. But nevertheless, you made a commitment to your husband, you made a commitment to your wife, and you made that commitment before God and before others. And God is able to enable you to work this through to the point where you can achieve a measured success. But it's going to be very tedious, since you've got someone who is, you're pulling and they're pulling back, that kind of thing. So it is a hard way to go. I hope that helps your question. Good.
Question of, you had pointed out earlier about if you make an accusation, there's four fingers pointing back at you. How do we bring up a difficult subject in such a way that we could have constructive dialogue about it without it being accusational?
Certainly, I think we'll come when we do conflict, and conflict resolution will come to some of that. But just to say, to create fear to bring it up is not healthy. Because very often, problems are not raised because of the reticence that's there. I'm afraid to do so because it will turn into World War III. And so we want to stay away from that. So you don't want that to happen. I think the liberty that we're saying that husbands and wives should feel is the liberty to be able to express, no matter what the situation is, or what her or his impression will be. There needs to be the liberty exercised so to do. And if you don't have that liberty, you need to start creating it. Because that's the only way that something will happen. Only when you bring questions up will there be answers. Other than that, if you harbor feelings, then what will happen is that you will harbor ill will and resentment as a result of not being able to address issues.
I just wanted to make a comment about that. In my relationship, if I'm trusting in his love, my husband's love for me, then I do feel free to be able to speak what I need to say, and that's what I've found in our relationship. I'm not afraid. I don't have fear in speaking it. I trust in his love for me.
So that gives you security.
Right.
Yeah. There are 3 S's that a relationship requires in regard to the wife's position. It's safety, which is one you just said, safety, security, and satisfaction. And if those 3 are existing, then it creates that kind of liberty. Any other questions? Go ahead,
Okay.
Lisa.
The levels of communication that you talked about from 5 to 1, and number two, with the feelings and emotions, the sensitive spots and all that, right? That, to me, it seems like these levels, on a daily basis, we'd be doing like, the 5, 4, 3, right? I mean, how do you get to, and how often because 3 seems like it's gonna be a while, like you're starting to get emotions or whatever, right? And then, 1 is, like, you need a night out for that? I don't,
A couple of nights.
Yeah.
Work it out.
You remember I said that there shouldn't be any vacillating between the levels of communication. We should arrive at level 1, and that should be our functioning spot at all times. Why? Because of what we just said. We have found safety, security, and satisfaction in the relationship. And hence, we should be at 1 because of that. But what happens is, because of the uncertainty that occurs, with us allowing the daily issues of life to so impact us, our emotions are affected, our desires are affected because of, and it may not be my husband or my wife directly, but it may be just the circumstances in general that then cause us to have a kind of imbalance. And hence you come home, and I then begin to think that I am the issue that you have, when in truth and in fact your issue was on the outside, but it has been sort of imbibed in the circle of the relationship, and it's now impacting the relationship. So what we need to have happen is a balance in our links with one another, so that no matter what the circumstances are, we maintain the level 1, we are honest, we have feelings one for another, we have a connection, there's connectivity one with the other, and that will keep us at that place even though everything else around us is falling apart. But we need to be at level 1. We should not be that I'm at level 5 today, and tomorrow I'm at level 3, and then next week 1. It shouldn't be that. It should be that there is consistency in our communication skills. I hope that we can strive for that.
Just clarifying, though, I mean, in our marriage, it took years for me to be able to communicate, not because of him, just because of my background and what I grew up with.
Mm-hmm.
But I find now, I tell him he created a monster, because now I tell him exactly what's on my mind. But I think, though, too, wouldn't you say that you need to gauge, okay, what's going on? Like, there are certain, I feel like I need to, like, this is not a good time to bring this up. Like there is that common sense of, okay, I can talk to him about anything, but this might not be the right time. He's distracted, or the right place.
That's good. So we don't want to bulldoze our partners either, and that's the point that you're making. So being able to gauge things, but it should not be a gauging because I'm reticent, I'm afraid. It should be a gauging because this is not the appropriate time. We're at dinner, we're enjoying a nice dinner, and we don't want to engage in any deep conversation at that particular moment. So you make a judgment like that. So certainly, yes, I think it's important to gauge situations, know when is the appropriate time, Maybe he's just come in or she's just come in from a long day's work that's overwhelming and needs to just relax and not ready to take any major issues at the moment. So gauging is important.
I think for us too, and he's admitted also that he says, if you don't get my eye contact, even though
Leave
I
me
say,
alone.
even though I say, that means I haven't heard a word of what you said. So make sure we're looking at each other when we're, if he's busy doing something, you know.
Yeah. Yes.
I would just add to that, that sometimes when we've had a very difficult problem to talk about, we've either scheduled it for a time where we knew we'd be undisturbed, or we found it very productive to take a walk outside when we've had to talk about something really hard, because walking burns off stress while you're talking. Being outside also gives more openness, and knowing that other people are around, you might choose to moderate your tone.
Yes, that's a good one. Okay. Anything else? Yes?
Just the fear of being vulnerable. I think both Matt and I, we, fear that. Like, we don't want to be said, oh, you did something wrong, or, but when we're in that vulnerable place, it's hard for us. So we're just wondering, how do you get past that defensive reaction? And, because I find my defenses coming up. Well, I want to defend myself. Well, I do this for you. Just, all that stuff. So it just comes up. And how do you put that away when you're trying to be vulnerable?
Very difficult, because this whole matter of comparative analysis is what usually happens. I did that. Oh, you don't remember what I did for you, and you keep going backwards and forwards. We have to be ready to give place to feelings, those feelings that we have about situations, though they may create some tension. And that's okay, because we're going to see in conflict and conflict resolution that conflict has its purpose. Conflict doesn't necessarily mean that, we have the gloves on and we're going to punch each other out. That's not what conflict is. Conflict is a disagreement, and we'll touch on that, is a disagreement of a difference of opinions. And so it is okay for us to come into conversation with a certain amount of the feelings that you've just expressed and work them through in the conversation. Okay, let's tone down. We don't need to be extremely outraged or mad about what you just said or what you did, but let's put it in perspective. What has happened? What can we do to change what has happened? That kind of spirit brings down or creates what I call the de-escalating, because you escalate by finger pointing, and then the escalator keeps going up. But the de-escalation would be, I'm coming down, I'm bringing it down, we are toning it down so that we can have a healthy discussion between each other. We're also diffusing. It's like the bomb that's in the building across the way, and the cops have come, and what they bring is the robot. And they no longer attempt to go in by themselves, they send the robot in. And the robot nips away at the wires, one by one, until he gets the last one. So what you have is the situation has been diffused. The bomb has no ability to go off. So if we can nibble away at those wires, then the bomb that creates this kind of contentious spirit has no longer any potential for disaster. All right, so why don't we go on then to conflict and conflict resolution, finish up, and then take some questions, and then we can have lunch. So since we've been introduced to conflict, conflict is a fact of life. It is defined as a contention, or in many cases, a sharp disagreement over one's certain interests or one's ideas or feelings. Each one of us has our own ideas, own interests, own desires, and which will very often come in conflict with the other, simply because we're different. Now, you hear all the time, I'm not sure that I should have married him or married her, because we are so different. Good reason? We are so different. We probably should not have gotten married. Well, I say all the time, I'm glad that you're different. Because can you imagine if you had married someone that was your like? What would happen? What a disaster. Yes, what a disaster. So we're thankful that as individuals, we are distinctly different. We have distinctive personalities, as opposed to having alike personalities. So as a result, we have wants, we have needs, we have desires, and that within itself is the potential for creating conflict, because differences will occur. These differences should not be with a view to causing us to lose our ground, lose footing. These differences, which are unique to each of us, should be to enhance us rather than to push us apart. That's what these differences should provide for us. A premise on which to function together to resolve whatever the conflict is and move on in an effective way. So wherever any of these differences will occur or will be present, as a result, conflict will come up. So what are these areas where conflict most often expresses itself? It expresses itself in expectations, needs, our financial issues, children and parenting, personal time and space, violation of marriage vows, the issue of trust, and then the matter of sex and sexual issues. But I don't want to forget this most important one, our in-laws. One of the assignments in the manual that I use is in-laws and outlaws. Yes, in-laws do create some major problems. Do we all have them? Yes, we all have them. But how are we going to work them out? So these are the areas that where conflict arises. I just want to read one verse in James chapter 4, or 3 verses rather, that point out where conflict very often comes from. James says, "Whence come wars and whence come fightings among you? Is it not thence from your pleasures, which war in your members? Ye lust and have not, ye kill and are full of envy and cannot obtain. Ye fight and war, ye have not because ye ask not. Ye ask and receive not because ye ask evilly, that ye may consume it in your pleasures." Just to point out how James just simply tells us where conflict arises. It arises because of a spirit of discontent. Discontentment leads to very often this position of not being able to be happy and satisfied with what we have. So as we look at these areas, let's see how conflict manifests itself. Very often it does either overtly or covertly. Overtly in the sense it is in an outward way with varying degrees of intensity. Varying degrees of intensity. Overt conflict. Open, almost open war. But then there are the covert, very subtle, quiet way, also with varying degrees of intensity, even when it is covertly done. As a result, the things that it produces, that conflict produces, would be things like anger. And I say that by qualifying it because I often say that anger is a healthy emotion, you know. It's not a negative emotion. It's like all the other emotions, love, joy, resentment, hatred. Anger is one of those. The issue is not with anger itself. The issue is with what you do with it. So, remember the scripture, Ephesians 4, verse 29? Be angry. But then it qualifies it. And sin not. But it gives the legitimacy to be angry. But it cannot have the element of vindictiveness attached to it. Very often, why it is so explosive, it is because we've lost control when we become angry. It's like the root beer. You know, you pour it out into a glass. And what happens? All the fizz and just this little bit of root beer. This is the anger here, but the fizz is really your reaction to it. And so often that's how we are in how we deal with anger. So it is indicative of being out of control. There then becomes bitterness, which will yield to distancing of oneself. Resentment, where we then despise and cause also distance. When I say bitterness, meaning distaste, leading to distance as well. And then fear and distrust occurs. So, in regard to conflict then, conflict provides an opportunity for growth. Conflict provides an opportunity for growth. If we again use the introductory remarks this morning that marriage is not to be looked at what it is actually, but what it is potentially, I think we can somewhat apply the same concept to conflict here. How to look at conflict? If we look at conflict as this battleground that we are engaged in all the time, which then leaves an uneasy and unsettled feeling. Because if we are experiencing conflict in our relationships that are constant, it will create uneasy feelings, very unsettling circumstances. So we don't want that kind of constancy of conflict. The conflict that should happen, that creates differences, should also at the same be the kind of conflict that can mend, that can cause you to merge together, because now you are in a joint way working the issues out together. So we want that to really be the essence as connected with how to effectively handle conflict. I wrote here, our differences are not intended to create a wedge or for the purpose of trying to change the other person, but rather to bring out each other's uniqueness. Think of that. It is not to create a wedge, but rather to bring out each other's uniqueness. So that elevates the situation, doesn't it? That conflict is to be used to bring to light each one's way of effectively dealing with and expressing the best possible way of resolution coming out. And that's how we need conflict to be. What are some of the things then we do when we are in conflict? One of the things is we withdraw. You know, us men, we love our man cave. So if there is conflict, there is a resorting to the man cave, withdrawing. There are 5 possible responses, of which one is the right response. So withdraw is not the right response. But I'm going to give you, at the same token, a positive on withdrawing. If your withdrawing has to do with taking time out to reassess the situation and to come up conclusively with a better feeling about it, then that withdrawing can be very positive. Withdrawing to assess. But most often it is not withdrawing to assess, it's withdrawing because I am bitter, I'm angry, I am hurt, I don't want to be here, I don't want to see you, I don't want to hear you. That kind of withdrawing is dangerous because it's putting a wedge then in the relationship that is very difficult to be removed. It's the kind of turn off situation rather than it being used as a cooling off matter. Then there is win. Win, W-I-N. So if I win the argument, and if I win whatever the situation is, who has lost? My wife says both. Yes? Yeah. Because, you know, you might be able to say as an individual, I won. And you might be able to carry the flag. But you might be standing alone. So what's the advantage? So win is not healthy. You may achieve your goal in winning, but you have sacrificed the relationship. Then there is yield. So the first 3 that I've given you are things that are used, but they're not effective. Because if you yield, what that does, it maintains the relationship, but it at the same time sacrifices the goal of the relationship because you're forever giving way. Because that's what yield means. I'm giving way. So if you keep giving way all the time, what do you think he will eventually do? He'll take the way. You give it, so he'll take it. Because she's always yielding, or he's always yielding. So yielding is not a healthy because it compromises the position. Then the other one is really compromise. I just threw that word in there, which is giving up your values. so that the standards in order so that to some degree there might be some harmony because you've compromised. You know, I don't like the fact that we're constantly always in conflict, so you know what? I'm going to compromise. I'll give up my rights. I'll give up my the standard so that you can have your way. And so again, if we do that, one has gotten something, the other has suffered, so the entire whole suffers. Last but not least, resolve. And that's why we have the subject matter, conflict and conflict resolution. Resolve. So what is resolve? This is the highest possible gain that a relationship can have. The highest possible value to be conferred upon the relationship is the ability to resolve the conflict. So does that mean then we've come up with an answer, and that answer is that we've agreed both with the other, each with the other? Doesn't mean that. What it means is that we have been able to sit together, we have heard one another, we have heard the hurts, the pain, the concerns, but we have both come up with somewhat of a decision that can facilitate a healthier relationship. There's an adjustment that takes place. That is, we're able to modify together and be in harmony in modifying whatever the decision is. We're working together here. We're not working against each other. And that's what resolution does for us. So, who has won in resolve? We've both won in resolve, as opposed to the spirit of win and withdraw and compromise and yield. So in resolution, we've got some resolve. So how do we effectively intervene to achieve these? There has to be a method then that we follow, a technique that we follow in order to arrive at resolution. Since we're saying it's not my decision or your decision, but it's now ours. How did we get there? One, instead of demanding my position, to set my position out, now I'm in the position of what we had earlier, I'm listening. I'm no longer issuing my statement. This is what it should be. We're now listening. Some verses from Proverbs will help us in terms of this matter of listening. Proverbs 18:13. Proverbs 15:23. So instead of demanding, we're listening. Select an appropriate time in order to address the conflict. Again, we don't want to bamboozle one another, but what we want to be able to do is to have an atmosphere that's congenial, whereby we can sit down and address that. Brother Frank says, take a walk with your wife in the woods. Make sure you bring her back. So select an appropriate time. Then it's important to define the problem. How are you going to have a conflict resolution if we have not set the problem on the table? We have to define the problem. What is the problem? And certainly, if we're going to listen as one of the items of not issuing demand, let's be sure that we don't assess the problem this way. Well, that's your problem. I don't see it as a problem. Let's be prepared to define it, but to agree, which would be, again, the thought we said earlier of validating the issue. Now, as defining the problem, you want to also define the areas in which you agree and the areas where you disagree, because that will help us to ferret out the problem then, because we're listing what we agree. So if we have agreed on things, we don't need to make an issue of it because it's agreed upon. But the disagreed points have to be addressed. But the mere fact that you have agreed on certain points kind of gives you the impetus to push ahead, because then that says you have the ability to negotiate things rather than having a spirit of resistance, a staunch disposition. Then identify your contribution. What is your contribution to the problem? What is her contribution to the problem? Identifying that helps in the resolving of it, so that there is fair fighting, if you put it that way. There isn't any one having an advantage above the other. There is a sense of equality in addressing the differences that we have. Then you want to focus on some of the behaviors that you are prepared to change. What are those behaviors that you're prepared to change? Having identified, having defined the problem, identify your own contribution, and seeing what the other's contribution is, now you are able to say to yourself, as a resolve, what can I do to change? And it would not be the one pointing at the other. We've said that very carefully, because we're not here to change the other person. If we bring things to the table, then the opportunity is there for, having had clarity on it, for you to make the change yourself personally. So let's identify those behaviors. Then last but not least, elicit the help of each other to implement those behavioral changes. Now, you become one another's check and balance in our relationships. There's a check, there's a balance. Bringing proper sense of what is appropriate and what is not appropriate to the relationship. If we had no checks and balances, what would happen? The relationship will never function as it ought to. You have in business checks and balances. You have in business those who are in the higher level of authority and those who are on a lesser level and those who are on a much lower level. And that works constructively for the functionality of the corporation. If you had all chiefs and no Indians, what would you have? If you have all Indians and no chiefs, likely would be a lot of trouble as well. But what we have in conflict then is that there needs to be the ability to help one another to achieve the objective that we have set when we defined the problem and were able to identify our contributions so that the issues can be resolved and so that we can move on a healthier basis than we have before. Okay, let's take some questions before the hour, and then we'll go to lunch. Go ahead, Richard.
Yes. Where you were saying earlier, the role of the man, the husband being the sacrificial role, and then one ineffective way of dealing with conflict as far as compromising the position. Your thoughts on how would you distinguish between them, between sacrificing yourself and then compromising yourself?
Well, we said that I don't necessarily view compromise. I didn't view compromise in this sense as an effective way to resolve conflict. Because when you compromise, just as you yield, you are surrendering some very important objectives and ideals of your own. So we want to be careful about using compromise as a resolution tool. The only tool that we're seeing is effective is the idea of absolute resolution. That's the only effective tool. And that doesn't mean we said that, okay, everybody's gotten his way. What it means is that we've been able to come to a place together, understanding that the conflict affects the whole. And hence, if the whole is affected, then let us both come to a place where we have one thing in view, the whole as the most important thing that must be kept in its pristine condition. Now, sacrifice is important. For you as the husband, for me as the husband. What does sacrificing do? And we will come back to that as well. When we sacrifice, we are giving place to. We're giving way to. We are giving of ourselves in such a way that it typifies what you read in Ephesians 5:25. Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. That is, he expended himself to the extent of giving up everything so that her benefit was the objective of his heart. The object is his love. It's the church. For you, the object is your wife. So you sacrifice in light of her. And then you don't go around complaining. You give as lovingly and willingly as ever. Go ahead, Sue.
So would you say then that, the idea of sacrificing when it comes to conflict resolution and, because the only commonality between those 3 or 4 ineffective ways of conflict resolution is the fact that there are always one way. So one person has to win, one person has to give way, one person has to compromise. But the resolution has to be together, both sides. So both sides have to come to sacrifice something in order for the true resolution, right? Is that
and I think that's essentially the point. I think you put it very wisely in that the first 3 are all one way. But when it comes to resolution, there is the whole, as I just said. The whole is before you. The relationship is before you, as opposed to, well, my rights, his rights. So if the relationship is before us, we're going to do what is necessary to keep the relationship in its healthiest form. And so, whatever that resolution means, I have sacrificed, he has sacrificed in order to achieve that objective. Yes.
I wonder if you feel like the main underlying problem in all this is that we don't really, either we're unable to or unwilling to really understand why the other person feels the way they do or believes what they do about the issue.
Mm-hmm. And that unwillingness has to be removed if there's going to be any effective resolution. But yes, very often there is that estimation that we're not taking into consideration the feelings and impressions of the other.
I know that my wife's family and how she was raised was very different from mine. So
I'm glad.
It's been good in ways. So sometimes when she feels a certain way about something, I don't understand how that it's possible to view things that way, because I don't really didn't really understand how, the values that she grew up with.
Yeah. And so that, I think, is also a part of the uniqueness of us as individuals. You see, when we came out of our families, we came out from a system that had indoctrinated us into certain beliefs, a belief system, a way of operation. And so we came out from that system, and your wife came out from that system as well. And so we've decided that now we're going to form our own system. And when we start trying to form our own system, what happens is the two systems come like this, and they start butting heads. Now, what we have to realize that we are now forming a unique system of our own. And that's where we have to work issues through, to create that unique system and to get away, not to ignore what we were in our individual families, because we can take the unique special features and merge them in, but we also have to realize we're forming a unique system all of our own. Yeah.
You shed light on the distinction between the sacrifice and yielding, and things of that like that in light of Ephesians 5. Now, I look at that from a husband's perspective, being a male. But what about from a female perspective? Like, she's supposed to surrender to her husband, So how is compromise and yielding not part of that equation and resolution?
Okay, if you don't mind, that's going to come up in the very next one, because we're going to do roles and responsibilities in marriage, and we're going to look at the husband's role, the wife's role of submission, and I'm sure we're going to get lots of questions on the wife's role of submission. Yeah, there are always plenty of questions on that. So if you don't mind, and you will come back with your question on that line, okay? Yes, Sue?
I kind of wanted to go back to, family differences, the way that you were basically educated before you came together, because it's important to me. You can rationally understand how your partner was raised, and you can rationalize the way that they behave, but how do you come to a place of acceptance of those differences in order to basically be able to, to make them part of your own system, so that, the values don't fight with each other but kind of merge? I don't know, so rationally I can put it into words, but how do you actually put yourself in that place?
Well, I think first of all, in bringing the two systems together, we have to get away from what I might call dogma, being dogmatic about my position. This is what my family did. This is what I was taught, so I am not giving it up. So if we come to a relationship with that kind of dogmatic approach, we're heading for World War III, IV, and V. So what we want to come with is bringing each other's system, because that's fine. That's my history. That's what we were accustomed to. You've come with yours, and we need to both have a sense of appreciation of the value that's associated with your system and his system. There's a sense of value to it. I mean, unless there's blatant abuse, things of that sort, then we need to check that. But where there is a healthy sense of systems in operation, let's acknowledge that. But at the same time now, let's talk about forming our own system. What can I contribute to? And what can he contribute to? And to be cognizant and really aware of the fact that as we're building our system, we have to be able to put away things that do not mesh with us as a couple. And to me, that's what will help to eventually bring the spirit of compromise, the spirit of sacrifice to the relationship. Yes, Lisa?
The steps that you gave for resolving conflict, the listening, defining the problem, behaviors to change, and then eliciting the help of others. So if you have a problem or a conflict, whatnot, and you're saying, okay, you know, you're saying that that person, your partner's the problem, which you said earlier, you're not supposed to say they're the problem. Then you're expecting them to say, okay, I'll change. I'm going to help you change. I don't know if I got that right because it's conflicting with what you said earlier. Do you understand my question?
All right. We said that we don't want to make the partner the problem. There are going to be certain things that happen in relationships where we're going to have to take the blame. That is, yes, it's my wife. Yes, it's my husband because of what he or she has done. Where there is a situation, a specific situation where that's concerned, where there's a violation that has happened, then that person has to take that, whether it's husband or wife, has to take responsibility for that. But where there is not any blatant violation per se, there is the lack of functioning effectively together because, you know, of idiosyncratic ways that we have and things that we do, then we need to be able to come to the table together, not with the idea that I'm going to change him or he's going to change me, but for us to look at the situation for what it is. What is it that's contributing to us having the conflict that we are having? What is it? Therefore, here it is. Let's talk about it. Let's not point the finger. Let's not say, I'm going to change you or you're going to change me. Let's be ready to change the behavior as it's identified to us, as opposed to becoming oppositional. Because if I'm oppositional and take a stance away from you, then there is no way that we're going to have a healthy compromise. So it is in that sense that I'm saying to use, not to point the finger, but to realize that each one of us has to change personally. Does that help you?
Isn't it true in marriage? I'm using sandpaper. There are different degrees of sandpaper that we use on certain woods. And sometimes things that happen in relationships or even our conflicts help to shape us depending on how much sandpaper there is. Do you understand what I'm getting at?
Yes. I didn't know that we used to use sandpaper on human beings. Yes, how difficult that would be, right? I often say that, using the same analogy, that sandpaper is a perfect piece of equipment, you know, perfect tool to use. But if you're using it on wood, it will do wondrously, but on each other, very, very painful. So yes, conflict can become like the agitating of sandpaper upon us. So if sandpaper used upon us is agitating, what do you think we should do? Keep allowing the sandpaper to be used, or use the experience as a means now of achieving and working through the issues? So that's what conflict will be like, a piece of sandpaper in that sense, in order to refine the piece of wood, which you and I are in that sense, so that we represent something smoother and something healthier than before. Yes?
When you're speaking about conflict, from men and women are wired very differently, as you
They
know.
are?
When a man sees a conflict, he's thinking in his head how to solve it. He's got it already set in his head. I got the problem solved. Here's the answer. The wife goes, well, honey, let's talk about the whole conflict in detail. So there's the conflict. The wife wants everything spoken about. Oh, honey, everything. And the husband going, okay, get it done with. I got the answer. And they come together. The husband has the answer, the wife wants to talk about the conflict, the whole thing. The husband wants to get to the answer, let's bring it together.
I'm supposing you're married, right?
Happily married.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't want the same people later.
The whole issue of the difference between the male and the female, that's another subject that I've dealt with. You remember the book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus? It's not really a Christian book per se, but it has some very, very important elements in it that represents the true distinct differences between us. So yes, one of the differences very often is that as males, we've got, and I use the analogy of Home Depot. Yeah, you know, when you go to Home Depot, you find the men and women there with the belts around their waists. And very often there are tools in the belts, right? That's us men. We have the belt on always because we're the solution. We're the solvers. And she says, but, you know, I'm not asking necessarily for a solution. I'm asking you to just listen. And because we are so prone to resolve, it makes it difficult for them to express completely. So maybe that's one of the reasons why they do demand that they want to hear everything, because we are so quick to give the solution, and very often without having heard completely the problem. Okay? So most likely that's why your wife is saying, I want the whole thing on the table, because I don't want you to miss those important pieces that you would like to gloss over. So she says, I want the whole thing. Yeah, but it's okay. If we have the spirit of listening and tolerance, then most likely when she's finished, then you can tell her, I had the solution long ago. Why did we have to go through the whole spiel? Yeah. Okay. Yes, Sue? Oh. Yes.
So everything you said so far has been really good. I think that some folks might have a difficult time implementing it because I've seen many times that sometimes there's been years and years of things that have gone on that haven't been dealt with, and so bitterness and resentment build up, and now you're so far down the road where you're just agitated at each other and you don't even know why, and you just walk in, you close the cabinet the wrong way, and the other person flips out and you're off to the races, and you're arguing about nothing. So how do you, in that sense, you don't even remember half the things that went on and why you're agitated, how do you hit the reset button to be able to sit down and start to put these things into practice?
Certainly difficult, because you've already kind of formed your own opinions as to the things you've heard. And you said, well, you know, we heard good things. How do you put them into practice? Well, we got to start with what's called implementation. Implementation requires this. I heard some good things today, but it was suitable for you, not me. So when we take that kind of position, we are already setting ourselves up as, I don't need that. It was for everybody else. Okay? But if we take to heart the things, each of us, speaker and hearer alike, take to heart the fact that these are sound, spiritual, doctrinal, and instructional things. I'm going to go home and I'm going to start. I'm going to make a commitment. We're going to be like the pig. I'm going to make a commitment, which involves that every time I'm tempted to slam the cabinet door, as soon as I put my hand on it, make sure my hand gets stuck in the air. I don't close or slam the cabinet door. I remember that I'm working on. Every time I'm tempted to do something that's that still fosters the old me and the old way I behave? No, I have to change that. So the conscious, cognizant approach to change is simply to not do it. I say very often, you remember Nancy Reagan's platform as the wife of the president was just say no to drugs? You know, there's no magical answer about that, but it's reality. A drug addict doesn't use drugs and recovers on the basis of not using drugs. Not that he got some pill or some magical something or went to therapy or treatment, as important as those are, because I treat them, it's because he says no. What we have to say as husbands and wives is no to the things that we have done in the past that continue to put us apart from each other. Hope that helps you. Yes.
Yes, I'm just thinking when you come into a situation where you need to compromise with your spouse, shouldn't you pray about it first together before you even start a conversation and bring the Lord to the table with you?
You can.
It's almost like a mediator in some sort of way.
Okay. Let me just say it this way. You can pray first and then still turn around and hold your own opinion.
You could,
Yeah.
I agree with that.
So what we want where that is concerned is, okay, if we open in prayer, we're asking that the Lord will help us both to have the disposition of wanting to hear what he has to say, rather than wanting to press what I would like to press. So if we do that, yeah, that puts us hopefully in the frame of mind where we allow him to express his thoughts to us. Then we have the ability to understand and agree, and then we can close in prayer and thank him for allowing us to come to that place where we were able to resolve the matter. But prayer is definitely an important weapon, because the enemy, wants to destroy. He is breaking down the marriage today. He's turning the marriages into other than what God has set up. He's removing the landmarks, and our government is removing the landmarks, and everybody else, society is removing the landmarks. I trust that we are committed to God's standard. We can close.
That's very good so far, right?
Amen.
Thank you. We did say there's no charge for the conference today or for the luncheon we're serving, but we are receiving a love offering for Dr. Daisley. There's a box right at the top of the stairs there with a sign over it. If you can put cash in, a check could be made out to New Creation Counseling. And, we want to bless our brother because we appreciate his time. There is 2 Italian heroes downstairs and an American, plus rotisserie chicken for gluten-free people and salad, so there should be something for everyone. And being from Long Island, I'm certain we have too much food. So when you leave, there'll be some in Ziploc bags. Please take something home with you, okay? Well, Father, we ask you to bless our food to our use. Thank you for providing so richly for us that we could be so well cared for, Father. And Lord, continue to keep our hearts and minds focused and awake, that we might receive all the benefit of what you want to do here today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.